Have you ever felt like you were merely a guest, temporarily residing in your own life, praying, waiting, hoping the universe would take pity and respond? But what if I told you this? The universe does not need your pleading. It only waits for you to remember who you truly are. This is not a book for those who wish to dream. This is a book for those who are ready to command with an awakened heart. Welcome to the Book of Unseen Law, a place where you do not learn something new, but instead remove the layers of forgetfulness that have clung to your power for far too long. The journey begins with you, the one whom reality is eagerly waiting to hear the first command from. The more you beg, the more reality remains silent. The paradox is that the very moment you desperately plead for your life to change, it falls into an uncanny stillness. The more you ask, the quieter the universe becomes. The more you pray, the further your desires seem to drift away. And then, you begin to wonder if anyone is even listening, if there is truly something out there that cares about someone as small as you. I have been where you are. And one day, I sat down, with nothing left to lose. I no longer asked for anything. I simply uttered, not with my voice, but with something deep within me, something that no longer wished or hoped, but simply knew. And that changed everything. I realized the silence of the universe was not indifference. It was waiting for me to speak in the right way, with the right awakening. Let me tell you a story. One that sounds like a fairy tale, but holds the first lesson I learned about the true nature of power. Long ago, in an ancient city called Damascus, there was a merchant named Michael Rodriguez. He was not lazy or lacking in effort. He did everything right. Rituals, prayers, formulas to attract luck, ancestral blessings, all of it. Yet his warehouse remained empty. While the merchants around him flourished like kites in the wind, Michael's store stood like a hollow bowl under the sun, dry and desolate. One day, in despair and frustration, he repeated the ancestral blessing his family had passed down for generations. But this time, he did not recite it the usual way. He said it backward. Not intentionally, but because his mind could no longer bear to perform the ritual. The phrase, "abundance flows like water," came out as water like flows abundance. It sounded meaningless, but perhaps for the first time in his life, he spoke without pretending to believe. He no longer tried to convince himself. He simply spoke with a reckless honesty. And then it happened. On the tiled floor, between the empty containers, a low rumble echoed like distant thunder, not from the sky, but from within the warehouse. The wind did not blow, yet the dust seemed to pause mid-air, and from the void, grains of wheat began to pour down, one by one, then more, until it became a stream. Michael could not believe his eyes. He watched as the containers filled, not by effort, but by something he had never done before. No begging, no chanting, just a word released from a place deeper than belief. When word spread through the marketplace, other merchants came running. They wanted the formula. They assumed he had some special incantation, a secret ritual, a clever trick, but he had nothing to give them but his experience. And he did not know how to explain it. How do you tell someone that true power arrives the moment you stop pretending you do not have it? I learned that from Michael, not from his story, but from the way I began to look at the words I used to say. The desperate prayers, the positive affirmations, the motivational phrases. I looked back and realized most of them were laced with doubt, as if I were pretending to be strong, hoping my words could fool the universe. But the universe is not deceived by language. It does not hear your voice. It feels the tone within you. You see, not every sentence holds energy. Power does not lie in syntax. It lies in the one who speaks and the level of certainty they carry when the words are spoken. Michael did not need a reverse incantation. He simply slipped out of the habit of pretending to be sacred. And that truth, so sincere that it needed no proof, became a command to reality. I began to practice that. I needed no rituals. I sat down and took an empty bowl, not to worship, not to visualize piles of gold and silver, but to see it as the space within myself, not as lack, but as pure space, waiting for something real. And I spoke, gently, as if no longer needing to force anything. I said, "Reality, fill this exactly with what I declare, not with hope, but with the stillness of knowing it will happen." That sentence did not feel like a prayer. It felt like a signal to myself and to the world that I was ready to live as someone who knows who they are. Since then, I have never spoken anything with doubt. I do not ask. I do not demand. I declare, simply, without debate. And I have realized this. What you declare with certainty, life has no choice but to arrange itself to make it true. Michael was not the only one, but he was the first reminder. The universe does not need you to scream. It needs you to remember. And once you remember, you no longer need formulas. You need only one sentence. But that sentence must come from someone who has stopped doubting who they are. So the next time you stand before an emptiness, a failure, or something yet to be, do not beg. Do not wait. Do not try to speak positively with a fearful heart. Speak with certainty. Speak as if you need no proof, and then watch how reality responds. Because power has never been in the spell. It has always been in the speaker, once they are truly awakened. And that is the first chapter you must remember, not to learn more, only to remember. This book was not written, it was carried in the blood. Have you ever felt your hand touch something that didn't quite belong to this world? As if the material you were holding was not just an object, but a doorway, a signal, a memory? Perhaps you were holding a thread, but your hand trembled as if it were grasping the very light of the stars. The question is, when that happens, do you believe you are the one creating, or just someone trying to hold on to something beyond reach? The second story I want to share with you is about a woman who lived high in the mist-covered mountains. Her name was Jennifer Sullivan, a weaver unlike any I had ever met. In her world, threads were not just materials, they were living currents. In her warm wooden cabin, where the loom stood against the wall, Jennifer lived an ordinary life, marked by something deeply extraordinary. Her loom seemed to have a soul of its own. It did not merely obey her hands. It waited for something deeper, like an instrument that remained silent until a true player knew how to summon sound from stillness. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridges and left a pale violet stretch across the sky, Jennifer faced something every seasoned artisan knows well: a block, a creative stillness. Her pattern refused to appear. The threads tangled like a maze, every stitch out of rhythm. In moments like this, most would put the loom away or take a break. But Jennifer was different. She looked straight at the wooden frame before her, not with frustration, not with doubt. She simply placed her hand on it and said, not loudly but deep enough that everything around her seemed to pause. She said, "You will weave the stars." There was no magic, no dazzling light. But in that moment, the threads began to change. They turned translucent, gently luminous like silk from the sky, as if Jennifer had plucked a piece of the night and laid it across her loom. And then, those glowing threads began to flow through the shuttle like water, soft yet steady, as though her intention had taken form and entered matter itself. What stopped me wasn't the miracle in that moment, but what Jennifer realized afterward. She said, "This world is not a pre-woven fabric. It is a loom waiting for command." Reality is not a result. It is a process waiting for someone to signal it. And that someone is not a saint or a genius. It is anyone quiet enough to remember they once commanded the light to move. Have you ever felt that you didn't need to try any harder? Only needed to take one true breath, and everything seemed to fall into place? That is not luck. That is the return of the voice within. This is the power of voice within. Not just a voice you hear, but a space you return to. It is not an outward sound, but an inner awakening, when you remember that every strand of reality is waiting for your signal. Jennifer did not weave with her hands. She wove with certainty. When she stopped repeating formulas, when she no longer recited inherited scripts, she touched something that every reality listens to, a command that does not shout outward but vibrates from within. The universe does not need you to say it perfectly. It needs you to speak as if you once shaped it, and in truth, you did. I have carried this story with me for many years. Each time I felt myself slipping away from the current of creation, I did not try to pull it back. I simply asked the invisible loom within me one question. What do you want to create with me today? No pleading, no forcing, just resonance. And reality, as Jennifer said, is a kind of thread waiting for someone patient and clear enough to touch it at the right frequency. What are you weaving into your day? Old fragments of memory, scattered anxieties, or a light that has never been tried before? Do not answer me now. Just walk into this day and notice what is in your hand. A pen, a steering wheel, a cup of coffee. Whatever it is, place your hand on it and whisper, not with your mouth but with your awareness. You know what you are meant to become. This world does not lack light. It only lacks those who remind the light that it was once a thread, ready to weave wonders. You are not someone trying to weave your life together. You are the one who once designed the tapestry of the stars. And you still remember how to do it if you become quiet enough to return, not to begin again, but to continue from where you left off. And when you do, the loom of reality will return to the rhythm that has always belonged to you. Reality does not respond to permission. It responds to tone. No one ever taught you that words are not just sounds. They are laws. And no one ever told you that reality does not need to understand your language. It only needs to feel the tone that comes from someone who truly knows where they stand. I used to believe, like many others, that if I chose the right words, performed the proper rituals, and spoke with sincerity, the universe would understand what I needed. But it does not listen to grammar. It does not judge your style. It simply responds to the frequency you emit. If you tremble inside while speaking with an outward tone of strength, reality does not follow. It feels that trembling. It waits for you to speak the words you no longer doubt. The third story I will tell you is not an illustration, but a reminder. An astronomer named Christopher Martinez once lived in the ancient city of Alexandria, where everything seemed to be measured by wisdom. He was unlike other scholars who merely recorded celestial orbits. He saw the stars differently. He saw them as anxious, as if those very celestial bodies were waiting for something to happen. Not for the sun to rise or the moon to wax full, but for a timely call. One moonless night, when all light had vanished, Christopher sat in his high tower. The oil lamp was empty, his summer equations unfinished. In total darkness, there was nothing left to continue, no light to write, no energy left to hope. In that place, at the very edge of limits, he did not complain, he did not blame, nor did he expect any miracle. He simply looked up at the brightest star and spoke in a low, steady voice, not as someone making a request, but as someone relaying an ancient command, one that had been used long ago and was only now returning. He said, "You will descend here and illuminate my work." Silence followed. No wind, no movement. Then suddenly, the star trembled. It did not flare. It did not explode. It simply moved, like a drop of dew falling from the edge of a leaf, gentle, precise, and unquestionable. It descended not because it was pulled, but as if it had heard exactly what it had long been waiting for. Its light lowered slowly, like a divine breath, and settled into Christopher's extinguished lamp. The lamp ignited. The light was not just bright, it was sharp as truth. Over the next 30 nights, Christopher wrote works that no one could later understand how he had accomplished. Perfect calculations, cycles no one had ever recorded before. They believed he possessed secret tools, astrological magic, or hidden knowledge. But he had nothing except a clear presence, and a tone that did not tremble. You see, what caused the star to fall was not the sentence, but the decisiveness that refused to wait for approval. When Christopher stopped begging for light and began commanding its presence, reality ceased to be a backdrop and became an instrument tuned to the right note. I came to realize that the farthest things are often the easiest to command if you maintain an undistorted connection between yourself and the universe. And that connection is tone, not voice, but the depth within the one who speaks. Nothing is distant if you no longer speak as someone standing on the periphery. The star was never millions of light years away from Christopher. It was within reach of the one who knew exactly where he stood in the greater order. And from that point on, I never looked at the sky as a place for dreams again. I saw it as a feedback system. Once, sitting alone in darkness, I did not try to light a lamp. I simply said, "Light, arrive exactly as I've always known you would." And when the light appeared, not from above, but from a quiet thought that ignited within, I knew that for the first time, I had spoken in the right way. Not because I was better, not because I was more deserving, but because I had finally spoken with a certainty that no longer required verification. And that was when all distance disappeared. There was no far. There was no near. There was only one question. Can you be still enough to speak as one who once created the orbits? Christopher did not teach you how to call stars. He simply left a trace. If you stop speaking like someone who pleads, you will remember how everything once obeyed your voice. And not just stars. Every law you thought was unchangeable. Every limitation. Every door that seemed forever shut. Reality does not listen to words. It does not read emotion. It feels only one thing, whether the tone you speak with belongs to someone who remembers or someone who has forgotten. If you are still afraid, it will remain silent. But if you know, not believe, not think, but know, then everything will begin to shift like a command programmed before time itself. That is power that requires no explanation. It only needs to be spoken, not dramatically, just decisively, because you are not persuading anyone. You are speaking as if everything has already been arranged, and reality, with all its force, has only been waiting for that very moment to begin moving. The loom does not need instructions. It waits for the signal of the universe. Not every absence is a loss. Some empty spaces do not need to be filled with anything tangible, but need to be touched by a different kind of awareness. And sometimes, what appears to be missing is actually holding the new shape of presence. I remember a story that seemed small, yet carried within it the entire depth of how reality operates. The story of a baker. Not a famous chef, not a wizard of flour, just a woman named Jessica Anderson who lived in a corner of a harbor town where the scent of warm bread blended with the sea breeze. She was not remarkable, had no secret recipe, and owned no special oven. But she had something no one else did. One day, as the city prepared for the autumn festival, Jessica faced the worst thing that could happen to a baker. She had no more yeast. Supplies were gone. The market was in panic due to shipping delays. Customers lined up, her shop stood empty, and time was running out. In any other circumstance, someone would have given up, closed the shop, apologized to the customers, blamed the situation, and perhaps sighed. But Jessica did nothing of the sort. She did not cry. She did not run for help. She did only one thing. She placed her hand on the flat, lifeless dough sitting in the tray and said, in a whispering tone that did not tremble in the slightest, "You already know how to rise." It may sound meaningless, but she was not speaking out of desperation. She was not gambling on a foolish hope. She was reminding the dough of what it already knew. Not through chemical knowledge, but through something more primal, a knowing that life, growth, transformation do not only require physical agents, but the permission of awareness. And then something strange happened. The dough began to gently tremble. Not like a chemical reaction, But like a living being, slowly waking from a deep sleep, it began to rise, slowly, steadily, confidently. It did not rise because it was forced. It rose because it had been reminded of who it was. When the bread was baked, the aroma that filled the air was unlike any batch before. There was something warmer, more alive, as if every grain of flour had remembered the ancestral memory of being bread. Customers ate and wept, not because it tasted good, but because they felt as if they were eating something that was truly alive, a loaf that had been touched by an unseen presence. From that day on, people asked Jessica for the secret. She had none. She did not change the recipe. She did not add strange ingredients. She did not possess magical yeast. She simply paused, touched the dough, and gave a command with a tone that held no doubt. I share this story to emphasize one truth that cannot be ignored. Matter is not inert. It is not just the result of cold chemical reactions or physical principles. Matter is sleeping intelligence. It remembers and it listens. But it does not listen with ears. It listens to the tone within the one speaking to it. If you tell the dough you need it to rise, but inside you still doubt, it will do nothing. But if you speak to it with a stillness that needs no proof, it will respond. I have tried this myself, not with dough, but with my own life. There was a time when I sat before an empty account, facing a vague future, and I said nothing except one sentence. Everything knows how to transform when I stop being afraid. I did not wish for money. I did not blindly repeat positive affirmations. I simply commanded the frozen reality before me that it was now ready to change form, and it did, not suddenly, but layer by layer, movement by movement, like water beginning to flow again after a long winter. Jessica did not change the dough. She reawakened the memory of matter, and that opened the door to a greater truth. Every situation in your life is also a lump of dough. Whether it is a dying relationship, a job that has lost its meaning, or a body weary with pain, they all contain within them a living memory. And that memory does not need a reason to return. It only needs a command strong enough, spoken not through words, but through a presence that holds no doubt. You cannot tell your life to get better if, deep inside, you are still preparing for failure. You cannot expect your body to heal if you are still observing it as a machine slowly falling apart. You must look directly at your most hopeless present moment and command it, just as Jessica did with the dough. Gently, precisely, without pleading. That is why the lesson is not in baking. It is in how you stand before everything that has not yet moved in your life and stop screaming. Instead, you touch it, both literally and metaphorically, and whisper, "You already know how to become the best version of yourself. Nothing needs to be added." You only need to remember how to command without doubt, and in that moment, the bread will rise, even without yeast. The situation will shift, even without a plan. The body will recover, even without a miracle. Because reality does not need a formula. It only needs someone quiet enough to command as if everything has always been possible. And then, magic is no longer strange. It becomes inevitable. Even a command meant for the stars must follow the right rhythm. You do not always need to know exactly what you are doing. There are moments when you simply need to be still. Place your hand upon something that appears silent and ask what no one has dared to ask. The story I am about to tell is not about a sage, a mystic, or a spiritual guide, but about a shepherd named Matthew Phillips. He lived in an ancient land of stone, where winds cut across the hills and the shadows of mountains stood like giants guarding forgotten truths. He was not extraordinary. He worked a job most considered monotonous, repetitive, lacking grandeur. But in his quiet steps through the grass, Matthew learned something few ever notice: that the land listens, the stones listen. And not only sheep require guidance, but the valley itself waits to be spoken to with respect. One evening, the sky broke open with a rare storm. Lightning split the air. The obedient herd scattered across the hillside. Darkness and wind erased every sense of direction. There was nothing to follow. No light. No sound could guide the sheep back. Most would have called out, shouted, chased them down one by one. But Matthew did none of that. He simply walked to a large stone, placed his hand upon it, and said, "You have witnessed thousands of herds passing through. You know where they are." His voice was not loud, not dramatic, just steady, as if he were stating something that had been known all along. What happened next was not a sound, but a movement beneath the earth. Gentle vibrations spread like an underground spring awakening. The stones along the valley shifted ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to open hidden paths never charted before. Through those narrow passages, the sheep returned, one by one, not hurried, not panicked, as if they knew exactly where to go. When the last one came back, Matthew did not celebrate. He simply nodded to the stone and quietly walked back to his tent. I tell you this not so you will start speaking to rocks, but so you understand that effort is not always the answer. Sometimes, what is needed is the stillness to acknowledge that what surrounds you is not lifeless. Reality is not mute. It waits for a command, but not the kind that comes from control, rather the kind that comes from a forgotten connection. If you speak in panic, the world will reflect chaos. But if you speak with quiet knowing, everything around you will find its rhythm. Matthew did not merely call the sheep. He awakened the landscape. He did not push. He did not force. He simply asked the right question in the right place, and the world responded. You can do the same. When everything in your life begins to scatter, when what you once held together now unravels, instead of chasing and controlling, pause and place your hand upon what is most solid within you, a value, a memory, a foundation, and ask, you know the way home. I too have known what it feels like to lose everything, beliefs, goals, even the people closest to me. In a moment where I felt I had nothing left, I did not try to pull anyone back. I just sat down, closed my eyes, and asked the question I had never asked before. Is there anything in me that still knows the way back? Not back to someone else, but back to the version of me that was never split. And then, piece by piece, memories returned, choices resurfaced. Old truths I had once ignored came back. Not with noise, but with a precision that was almost unreal. Matthew was not special. He simply understood that nature does not need to be controlled. It needs to be reminded that it once lived in order. And disorder is not born because the order was broken, but because the observer forgot they were once part of that order. When you remember that everything living around you is waiting for a signal from a heart that listens, you will never again feel abandoned in chaos. The truth is, you do not need to run and gather the scattered sheep of your life. You only need to place your hand upon what you once deeply trusted, whether it is a concept, an experience, or a place, and let your presence issue a silent command. Everything else will return to its place. Not because you are a great controller, but because you stopped interfering the wrong way. The greatest lesson in Matthew's story is not about herding sheep. It is about the relationship between the human and the environment. If you see reality as a cold, lifeless block, you will never move it. But if you remember that within every stone lies an ancient intelligence waiting to be spoken to in the right way, you will see that nothing is beyond rearrangement. Reality does not answer pleas. It does not work for those who cry for help. It only responds to those who remember that everything always knew the path. It just needed to hear confirmation. And that confirmation is not a shout. It is the stillness that knows where it stands. When you have that, the sheep will return, the wind will soften, the earth will open, and you will no longer be the one lost in the storm. You will be the anchor everything comes back to, not because you control, but because you have stopped trembling. And that alone is enough for the world to obey. Dough does not rise because of yeast. It rises because it remembers it can. Not everyone knows that the most powerful force within a person is not what they show on the outside, but the silent tone that resounds within them every single day. Not the voice that is spoken aloud, but the inner resonance that determines whether you rise or fall in the unseen moments. I once believed that in order to change something in life, you had to shout, to raise your voice, to be heard by others. But then, one day, I understood. The force that truly moves things has never come from noise. It comes from a deeper space where sound no longer echoes outward, but begins to echo inward. The story I share with you today is about someone who did not speak much, did not appear often, and left no mark on golden plaques or marble statues. His name was Elijah, a quiet artisan who lived tucked away in an old neighborhood where no one cared about painting anymore. People chased machines, mass-produced prints, flashy colors, and convenience. But Elijah, he continued to sit in front of his canvas with a worn-out brush and a box of paint holding only a few remaining shades. Each day he painted a single stroke, nothing more. People said he was slow, that he was outdated, that he was clinging to something already dead. But Elijah never argued. He didn't need to, because to him, every brushstroke was a sentence. Not written, not shared, just spoken through the quiet movement of his hand, guided by a voice uniquely his own. A voice that didn't speak out loud, but was perfectly clear. And I realized he didn't paint to show anything. He painted to stay connected to an ancient language within him that would vanish if he stopped. One day, a 10-year-old girl, lost and in tears, wandered into Elijah's studio. Her face was streaked with fear, her feet dirty from running through streets no one remembered. Elijah didn't ask her name, where she came from, or why she was crying. He simply pulled up a chair beside him, placed a small canvas in front of her, and without another word, painted a single stroke. Then he handed her the brush. She was still trembling, but for reasons she couldn't explain, she took it and painted a short line, then another. For the next 2 hours, neither of them spoke. Only brushstrokes, simple, not beautiful, not logical, but full of life. When her parents arrived, they found their daughter sitting calmly, breathing steadily, and for the first time in weeks, not panicking. Elijah accepted no reward. He gave no explanation. He only said one thing to the girl: "Your brushstroke doesn't have to look like anyone else's. It just has to match the voice inside you." She looked at him, as if someone had finally appeared not to fix her, but to help her remember. And that was when I understood. Elijah was not merely painting. He was guarding a gate that led back to the inner voice. Not loud, not performative, not preaching. Just a quiet space where the voice inside each person could speak without being interrupted. This is the power of voice within. Not just a voice you hear, but a space you return to. I once asked Elijah why he painted only one stroke a day, why he didn't go faster, be more efficient. He simply smiled and said, "There are things that lose all meaning if rushed. One stroke a day is how I keep my inner voice from getting lost." Since then, I began to live differently. Not slowing down out of resignation, but slowing down out of respect. Each morning, I take a few minutes, not to start the day, but to ask where my inner voice is. Sometimes it's somber, sometimes angry, sometimes still like a quiet lake. But I've learned, as long as I return, I will never drift too far. Elijah taught me what no book ever said clearly. That life does not wait for you to shout to be heard. It waits for you to remember you can whisper and still command reality to listen. And to do that, you don't need to learn anything new. You only need to recreate the space within, where your true voice has a place to stand. Not the voice you use to communicate, but the voice you hear when you no longer have to answer to anyone. Maybe you are moving too fast. Maybe you are speaking too much. Maybe you are using language to prove something even you are not sure you believe. Then it's time to stop. Not to rest, but to return. Return to the place where your inner voice still waits to be heard, no matter how long it has been forgotten. No one else holds that gate. No one else knows the key. Only you. And only when you become still, without resistance, without trying to understand, will the gate open. And you will enter a space that requires no sound, yet is filled with presence. A place no one else can see. But if you lose it, the whole world becomes blurry. Elijah was just a man who painted one stroke a day, but each stroke was a greeting to the soul, a gentle knock on the depth. And every time the brush touched canvas, the world knew one more person still held on to their voice. Do you still hold yours, or have you traded it for speed, approval, and hollow noise? This is the power of voice within, not just a voice you hear, but a space you return to. And if today you haven't found your way back, tomorrow still holds a stroke waiting for your return. And this time, let your hand lead the way. The voice. It's ready. All it needs is your stillness to be heard. You don't need a whistle to call the herd. Just the earth's silent tremor will do. There is something curious that few people notice, and it is this. When you begin to hear your inner voice more clearly, the outside world begins to change the way it responds to you. Not because you've discovered some sacred secret, but because the frequency you emit has shifted, and reality is nothing more than a mirror. Ruthlessly honest. It does not react to what you say you want. It reacts to the tone you emit, even when you're unaware of it. I still remember a winter afternoon in a quiet town by the lake, where life moved so slowly you could hear the wheels creaking over wooden roads. There lived a man named David, a repairer of old clocks. His shop was hidden behind ivy-covered walls. No sign, no advertisement, only an old wooden door and the sound of ticking leaking through the cracks. People said David was the last in the region who still fixed clocks by hand, because he didn't just repair broken hands, he mended lost time. I once asked him, "How do you know what a clock needs when all they are is machinery?" He smiled. Clocks are just like people. Not everything needs a new part. Sometimes they just need to hear a calm enough voice to start working again. I thought he was joking, until I saw an old woman bring in a family heirloom, its glass face fogged, its strap rusted, and she said it had stopped the day her husband passed away. David didn't ask a thing. He didn't dismantle it, didn't measure or calculate. He simply placed the watch in his palm, closed his eyes as if he were speaking to it. After a while, he opened his eyes, turned a tiny inner notch, and laid it on the table. The minute hand twitched. The hour hand followed. A tick echoed, slow but steady. The old woman teared up and whispered, "I thought it would never come back to life." David said only one thing. It was never dead. It just needed someone to speak to it the right way. That moment made me reflect more deeply than any self-help theory ever had. Reality doesn't operate on rigid logic. It doesn't just respond to skill or tools. It responds to presence. And presence is not something you generate by trying hard. It is what naturally emerges when you stop trying to be someone else and start being fully, unmistakably yourself. I began observing myself. Every time something in life went off track, instead of rushing to fix it with action, I sat down and listened to what tone I was really broadcasting from within. Sometimes it was anxiety disguised as confidence. Sometimes doubt dressed up as decisiveness. And just like David said, not every solution needs a grand gesture. Sometimes all it takes is the slightest adjustment, and the ticking returns to its rhythm. You might be living in a home where people don't understand each other, don't speak, don't connect. But instead of forcing someone to listen, ask yourself, are you speaking from presence or from the hunger for validation? A sentence spoken from a place of calm cuts through silence like a blade through water. A voice from lack, no matter how loud, only widens the distance. I began practicing speaking less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to make sure that when I did speak, the tone came from somewhere clear and genuine. I realized that by simply adjusting my internal presence, the way others responded to me also shifted naturally, as if they weren't really hearing my words, but the version of me I was embodying in that moment. Just like David wasn't fixing the clock, he was helping it hear the tone of time again. You don't need to control others. You don't need to force reality into compliance. You only need to emit the right tone, and everything will realign like a song finding its proper tempo. So if something in your life is out of tune today, stop blaming the environment. Stop trying to manipulate the outcome. Return to yourself, listen closely, and recalibrate the tone you are living with every day. That may be the only thing you truly need to do. No one hears that tone clearer than you, and no one else has the authority to adjust it but you. Reality is a space waiting for you to speak the right word, but not through your mouth, through your state. A state without tremble, a state without performance, a state that does not seek validation from the outside. And when you are in that state, the ticking will return, time will revive, and what once seemed lost will return as if it had never left. You do not need to be the best. You only need to be the most honest version of yourself. Every off-key moment in your life is just an echo of an inner misalignment. Adjust that, and everything else will follow. That is how truth is repaired, not by force, but by silent precision. Subtle enough that no one else sees it, yet powerful enough to make the world stop and listen. Healing does not require fixing. It only needs to be called back. There is a truth no textbook ever teaches you. The world does not respond to what you say. It responds to how you show up. Saying you are okay does not make you okay. Saying you are strong does not make others believe you are strong. Everything around you does not listen to your words. It listens to the tone of who you are. And the surprising part is, sometimes you don't even realize the tone you are broadcasting until everything around you starts to fall apart. I once knew a woman named Clara, a literature teacher in a small town, and by everyone's account, she was gentle, wise, and deeply thoughtful. But there came a time when her classroom turned chaotic. The students stopped listening. Her lectures no longer held attention. Everything seemed to turn against someone who had long been seen as a symbol of calm and authority. Clara didn't understand. She tried changing her teaching methods, updated her approach, added more interaction, more technology, but the harder she tried, the more disconnected everything became. One day, when the class was so noisy she couldn't continue the lesson, Clara stopped. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked out the window in silence. I happened to be there that day as a guest observer, and in that moment, when Clara stopped trying to teach, stopped trying to control, something in the room shifted. No one told them to, but the students began to fall quiet. Slowly, strangely. No one knew why. Clara didn't look at her students. She just stared out the window, and in her gaze, I saw someone no longer bracing, no longer battling, but fully present with herself. No anger, no disappointment, no pleading, just presence in its purest form. Then she turned around, not to scold, not to lecture, but simply to ask one question. "Can you hear the tone of our classroom today?" A student whispered, "Chaos." Clara nodded, then said, "Then I don't need to say anything more." After that day, the class slowly changed, not because Clara changed the curriculum, but because her presence had changed. She was no longer someone trying to keep the class in order. She became the calm center around which everything naturally adjusted. I learned from Clara that you cannot pretend to be a frequency you do not actually embody. You cannot say you are at peace when your heart is full of fear. You cannot say you trust when your whole energy is doubt. And you certainly cannot expect the world to treat you with respect if you do not respect yourself by remaining silent before what is hurting you. We live in a time where everyone speaks too much, explains too much, but shows up too little. And so, no one really hears anyone. People are constantly sending out signals, But those signals come from fractured, distorted sources. The only thing that can recalibrate those frequencies is absolute honesty with oneself. Not verbal honesty, but energetic honesty. You don't have to say, "I'm okay" when you are breaking. You only need to be fully present with the breaking, and reality will respond with healing instead of chaos. A friend of mine once lost everything within a year: his job, his marriage, his health. He was once the cheerful one, always encouraging others. But after that collapse, he vanished. No social media, no returned calls. Until I found him, sitting in an empty room, saying nothing, but his eyes were strangely bright. He didn't need to explain what happened. I could feel the new tone in him without a single word, a quiet strength that no longer needed to prove anything, a kind of stillness that had reached the root. He told me, "There's nothing wrong with falling apart. The mistake is in trying to stay intact when inside you're screaming." And I realized that was why everything in my life had once felt chaotic, not because I wasn't good enough, but because I wasn't living in alignment with my true tone. I was pretending to be calm while my heart was in resistance. Clara and my friend taught me the same thing, that reality never lies to you. It simply reflects exactly what you are becoming. And to change the outer world, you don't need more words. You need fewer falsehoods. When you strip away all your posturing, all your efforts to perform, you begin to emit a kind of silence that is magnetic, where no one hears a sound, but everyone knows they must adjust. You cannot create order by control. You create order by becoming an anchor, a point that everyone who passes by can feel is stable, without needing it to be spoken. And to become that anchor, you don't need to be strong in the conventional sense. You only need to be completely honest with your real feelings, your real dreams, and your real values. Since that day, I began asking myself each morning, what is the tone I'm living with today? Sometimes it is gratitude. Sometimes it is sorrow. But whatever it is, I don't run from it. I choose to broadcast it clearly, without excuses, without hiding. And the miracle is, everything in the day responds accordingly, as if I no longer live in a chaotic world, but in one that understands what I am becoming. Your true tone is the only thing you ever need to adjust. When it is right, everything else falls into place on its own. No forcing, no convincing, just the courage to hear yourself clearly and to live by that truth. Because the world does not need you to speak louder. It needs you to return to the quietest center within yourself. And from there, everything begins to shift, silently but surely, just as dawn always knows when to rise, without ever needing an announcement. Writing is not just record-keeping, it is the remote that commands reality. I used to believe that if I wanted my life to change, I had to do something grand, loud, and extraordinary. I was convinced that unless I created an echo, no one would notice my efforts. But then one day, I realized the most profound shifts don't come from explosions, but from subtle inner adjustments, so refined that only those who are truly still can feel them. These changes don't need to be seen, don't need recognition, and yet they ripple through the world like a compass needle being moved slightly, redirecting the course of an entire ship. Let me tell you a story. There was a man named Marcus who worked as a security guard at an old library. His daily job was simple: open the doors, tidy the entrance, check the shelves, and sit quietly at the desk near the exit. He didn't talk to anyone, and no one really paid attention to him. Yet there was something strange. Everyone who walked into that library felt an unexplained sense of peace. Children stopped yelling. Adults naturally lowered their voices. Even people who lived in a rush would unconsciously slow down as they passed by him. One day, I sat and watched Marcus, curious how someone who said nothing could influence a space so profoundly. And I realized it was the way he was present. Every movement he made carried a quiet respect for the space and the people in it. He didn't ask anyone to be silent, but his silence was so clear it acted as a mirror, reflecting back the noise in others. He didn't say, "Be quiet." He simply was quiet, and that was enough. Later, I asked him if he noticed that people changed when they passed by him. Marcus simply smiled and said, "I don't try to change anyone. I just try not to throw off the rhythm of the library. If someone chooses to sing out of tune, I don't stop them. But I don't join in either. I just hold my own key." That answer changed how I live. I realized influence isn't about how many people you can get to obey. It's about how clearly you can hold your own tone so that others naturally feel their own dissonance in your presence. You don't need to command. You only need to live in tune, and the world will adjust itself. I look back at myself. There were times I shouted for respect, yet inside I was full of insecurity. Times I demanded others to be kind, while I was still compromising on values I didn't even believe in anymore. I tried to change others while ignoring the misalignment in how I faced life, and in doing so, everything I did became exhausting, because it didn't come from clarity, it came from control. Marcus never controlled. He was simply an anchor, a presence deep enough, true enough, steady enough to remind others that another way of living was possible. And I realized we don't need to become speakers, leaders, or heroes to make an impact. We just need to become a clear enough version of ourselves. When your inner rhythm is consistent, no matter how chaotic the world becomes, you become a still point. And that stillness, by its very nature, draws in what belongs and pushes away what does not through force, but through frequency. We live in a world of too many voices and too little listening. Everyone is sending out a signal, but most are full of static, not because they are wrong, but because they've forgotten that the strongest thing they emit is not what they say, but how they live. You don't need to say you're healing if you truly are. You don't need to pretend to be strong if your strength comes from sincere acceptance. I've learned that sometimes the greatest thing you can do is not to step onto the stage, but to step inward and live with such clarity and groundedness that your very presence shifts the energy of the room. When you truly understand the value of silence in tune, you stop needing many words. You choose instead to live as someone who holds the rhythm for life. And every place you enter feels like a symphony quietly tuning itself, not because you demanded it, but because you were tuned well enough to reveal the discord. Since that day, I stopped blaming the world for not understanding me. I began turning inward, checking whether I was holding my own note. If I broadcast panic, I do not expect others to bring peace. If I emit doubt, I do not demand trust. I take responsibility for the frequency I live with every day. The truth is, you are always broadcasting, whether you realize it or not, and life simply responds to that frequency. No permission needed, no negotiation required. It listens to your tone, not your words. And if you want your life to change, adjust the tone first. Don't adjust people. Don't adjust the environment. Adjust yourself. You are the one holding the string. And if you tune it right, the entire orchestra will slowly tune with you. Not instantly, but inevitably. Because true tone always holds power. It doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be clear. Clay is not stubborn. It simply resists being shaped by force. I once thought that voice was just something that came out of the mouth, a collection of sounds used to communicate, to persuade, to express. But after years of living and observing, I came to realize there is a kind of voice no one hears with their ears. No machine can record, but all of us sense through intuition. It is the inner voice, a silent frequency that penetrates deeply. It needs no explanation, yet it causes the world to fall quiet and listen. A person with a clear inner voice does not need to argue to be respected, does not need to prove themselves to be acknowledged. They are present, and everything adjusts to them. This is what I call the power of voice within. Not just a voice you hear, but a space you return to. I once met a strange man named Eli, who lived in a small house near the woods. He was not a speaker. not a monk, nor a spiritual master. Yet anyone who passed through Eli's home felt a calm that was hard to explain. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words didn't sound like teachings or deep philosophies. But somehow, a few of his simple sentences could calm a panicked soul. Someone who hadn't slept in years might nap peacefully after just one afternoon with him. Someone wrestling with a life decision might take a quiet walk with him and suddenly know what to do next. I once asked Eli where he had studied, what he had practiced. Eli only smiled and said, "I didn't study anything special. I just listened more than I spoke, and I discovered that if I am quiet enough, a voice inside begins to speak, very real, very clear, and I only need to live in alignment with it." At first, I didn't believe him. How could silence change anything? But then I tried. In the early mornings, I stopped checking my phone, stopped making task lists, and simply sat, listening. Not to outside sounds, but to the tiny tremors inside. The questions that had gone unanswered. The wounds that had never been touched. The longings that had never been admitted. And I began to understand what Eli meant. You cannot broadcast a true tone if you haven't listened to what you really want. And that inner voice is not the whisper of fleeting emotion. It is the lasting resonance of your lived values. When you live in harmony with that frequency, everything you say carries weight, not because it is loud, but because it matches the truth within you. When others hear you, they do not hear your words. They hear your alignment. And that consistency is the strongest signal for life to begin listening back. I realized that every time I was misunderstood, rejected, or ignored by the world, I was saying things my heart didn't fully believe. I was trying to appear confident while full of doubt, trying to inspire others while I myself was exhausted. And it was no surprise that the world didn't respond. Reality doesn't deceive. It doesn't run on promises. It runs on your inner tone. From then on, I changed how I lived. I no longer forced myself to speak when I wasn't ready. I spent more time listening, not to find answers outside of me, but to become aware of what I was already sending out. Some days, I found my inner voice was the sound of a wound yet to be healed. Other days, it was a quiet invitation to return to something I once abandoned. And as I began to live in full honesty with those tones, without hiding, without denying, things around me began to change. People listened more. Opportunities came at the right moments. Those out of sync slowly drifted away. Those in resonance began to appear. Not because I did anything extraordinary, but because I returned to my original tone. Have you ever felt the presence of someone who changes the atmosphere just by walking in? They don't say much, but their presence makes you feel safe. When they speak, you listen. When they are silent, you still feel something alive. That is the sign of someone who has found their inner voice and lives in harmony with it. They do not try to be liked. They do not try to be trusted. They simply are, clear, grounded, undivided. And that wholeness becomes the most powerful invitation for life to respond. We've grown used to chasing noise, external standards, the approval found in other people's eyes. But the more we chase, the farther we drift from the real call within. And eventually, we get tired. Not because we haven't tried hard enough, but because we've lost connection to the source of our real tone. When that happens, stop. Come back. This is the power of voice within. Not just a voice you hear, but a space you return to. In that space, there is no pressure to be perfect, no need to be right. Only one requirement remains: honesty. Honesty with what you truly think. Honesty with what you genuinely feel. Honesty with the dreams you once had but hid away. And when you live from that place, you won't need complicated strategies. Every action you take will carry clarity. No one will have to guess. No one will have to doubt. They will feel it. And reality like a loyal mirror, will begin to reflect what matches your tone. I want you to try something. Before stepping out into the world, sit for a few minutes. No need to pray. No need to visualize anything positive. Just ask, what is the tone of my inner voice today? And if it is sadness, don't rush to fix it. Live truthfully with it. If it is hope, let it shine. If it is torment, give it space to breathe. And you'll see, from that place, everything you say begins to carry weight. Not because it's loud, but because it's real. And life, quietly but precisely, will begin to hear you. Not through ears, but through resonance. Like an instrument knowing when the string has been tuned just right. And from there, the new music of your life begins. No performance, no grand introduction, just one true tone. And everything will follow. Fish do not need to be caught. They only need to be called with respect. I once witnessed a man walk into a crowded room without saying a word, and yet everyone turned to look at him. It wasn't because of his appearance or how he dressed. It was something else, something about him that radiated a presence you simply could not ignore. A presence that pulled everyone into the moment, made them stiller, deeper. He didn't say, "Listen," but everyone became quiet. He didn't ask for respect, yet no one dared to treat him lightly. And in that moment, I realized there are people who don't need to raise their voice to carry weight, who don't need to explain to have depth. They've done the inner work long enough that their voice, whether spoken or silent, carries a gravity that cannot be overlooked. I began observing the world more closely. I noticed most people speak from an unclear place. They speak from fear, from the need to be validated, from wounds that haven't yet healed. And because of that, no matter how polished their words are, no matter how sharp their logic, their voice still feels out of place. No one responds the way they expect. No one truly understands them. Because the world doesn't listen with ears, it listens to frequency. And frequency cannot be faked. It is the byproduct of what you've faced, what you've taken responsibility for, and what you've healed. I once sat with a friend named Caleb. He had just come out of a breakup that had stretched over nearly 2 years. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but deep, like a silent earthquake. He told me, during those months, he stopped trying to be understood by others. He just tried to understand himself, and once he did, he no longer needed to speak as much. I asked him what had changed the way he communicated with others. Caleb smiled and said, "I stopped speaking to defend what I hadn't yet made peace with. Now I only speak when everything inside me is quiet enough to be true." I thought about that for a long time. It turns out, we often speak not because we're clear, but because we're still scrambling to assert something we're unsure of. When you truly understand something, you don't need to talk about it endlessly. When you truly believe in something, you don't need to prove it. You simply live it. And that lived frequency will transmit itself more powerfully than any presentation ever could. I used to talk a lot. I always had answers for everything. I tried to use logic to untangle emotions, analysis to convince feelings. But the more I spoke, the more disconnected I felt. People heard me, but they didn't connect. They nodded, but nothing changed. Then I realized it was because I was emitting 2 different frequencies. One on the outside that sounded reasonable, another on the inside that was full of chaos. And the world does not respond to what you say. It responds to what you carry. I spoke about peace when I was anxious. I spoke about trust when I was filled with doubt. And so I became someone without a clear tone. And a person without tone has no pull. Since then, I changed how I approach life. I no longer explain what I have not yet lived. I only speak about what I'm practicing. And if one day I have nothing to share, I choose silence. Not because I don't matter, but because I'm holding space for something to ripen within me. I don't need to show up in words all the time. Sometimes, presence in silence is the clearest message of all. Like how light never needs sound to shine. This world is hungry for those who emit a true tone. Not because they are perfect, but because they are honest. Not because they know everything, but because they live in alignment with the clearest part of themselves. When you enter a conversation from a place where you no longer need to prove, no longer need to win, you begin to radiate a strange force, a force that lowers other people's defenses. They begin to hear you not just with their minds, but with their hearts. And when the heart opens, any change becomes possible. You don't need to be a great speaker. You only need to be someone who lives truthfully. From there, your words will begin to carry depth. Not because you've chosen clever phrases, but because you're no longer using language to cover anything up. Your voice will become clear, not because you speak louder, but because you are aligned. And reality will respond to you not through words, but through frequency. Because the inner voice has never been about sound. It is energy. It is the aliveness that flows from a soul no longer in conflict. It is the resonance of a person who has returned to themselves. When you are clear, you don't need to be impressive. When you are steady, you don't need to win. You become the quiet center others look for when they feel lost. You become a reference point, helping others recalibrate their heartbeat, their breath, their way of living. And it all begins with one simple thing. Not speaking what you haven't lived, not living what you haven't believed. Let every word you speak be a door into who you are. If it is empty, people will pass by. But if it is full, people will pause, listen, and sometimes even change. Not because you persuaded them, but because you were truly living what you said. And that, always, is the most powerful force of all. The desert only needs someone to remember it was once Eden. I still recall the moment I realized that everything in my life was silently repeating itself. Relationships followed the same script, only the characters changed. Disappointments kept showing up. No matter how much I changed my environment, my job, even the country I lived in. And then it struck me. What remained unchanged was not the circumstance, but the frequency I was living on. I was still emitting a familiar signal, and life, with brutal precision, responded to that signal alone. Have you ever felt like that? That no matter how hard you try, no matter how far you run, you somehow always return to the same point, just with a new layer of paint? That is not because you are weak. It is because the voice within you has not yet changed. And life does not respond to your plans. It responds to your tone. I began observing how I entered each day. I paid attention to the inner state I carried before writing a word, before saying a sentence, before sending a message. I realized that if I brought yesterday's frequency into a new day, then no matter how much I changed my slogans, goals, or actions, the outcome would still be a slightly altered version of what I had already experienced. Real change does not begin with the first behavior. It begins with a shift in tone. When the tone changes, the whole world around you changes. But to shift your tone, you cannot simply force yourself to be positive. You must dare to confront the unnamed parts within you. The old wounds you've learned to ignore. The fears you've dressed up with words like, "I'm just being cautious." The disappointments you've hidden behind self-deprecating jokes. You cannot change what you are unwilling to face. And sometimes, growth does not begin by learning something new, but by daring to name something old. Naming the loneliness, the anger, the jealousy, the insecurity. When you dare to look, you begin to create distance between you and them. And in that distance, you are free to choose a different tone. Let me ask you, when was the last time you truly listened to your inner voice? Not the voice of the ego trying to stay in control, not the echo of fear that has been fed for years, but the real voice, the one that doesn't scream for attention, but quietly waits to be noticed. It doesn't demand anything from you. It simply invites you to live truthfully. And when you do, even the smallest act becomes a pivot that changes everything. I used to believe I had to wait until I was strong enough, stable enough, smart enough to change my life. But eventually, I realized you don't have to be perfect to begin. You just have to be honest. Honest with yourself, right where you are, even in the version of you that is still messy and full of doubt, because no one can change what they are still trying to deny. But the moment you say, "I've seen it," then in that very moment, you are no longer vibrating at the same frequency. You've shifted. And that shift, no matter how small, is enough to crack the old pattern, and light begins to enter through that crack. I write these words not to teach you anything. I am simply recounting the truest journey I have ever walked, in the hope that you too might begin your own, quietly, without grand declarations, just by gently admitting, "I am ready to change." If you're still reading this, leave a small sign. Just type the number 1 in the comments, or write those words, not for me to know, but for you to affirm to yourself that you are listening to the inner call, that you no longer want to return to the old patterns, that you are ready to move toward yourself, even if just one small step today. And if you feel this message touch something in you, I want to thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being brave enough to sit with yourself in a world that never stops rushing. You may not know the entire path ahead. You may still feel confused and tired. But as long as you hold on to the fragile thread that connects you to your inner truth, you will never be too far gone, because the voice within you is still there, still waiting for you to come home. And that, right there, is the power of transformation. We do not change the world by shouting louder. We change it by tuning the sound within ourselves. One person shifts tone, the room becomes still. One room shifts tone, a community begins to transform. One community changes, and the world can be reshaped. But it all begins with one individual who dares to say, "I'm tired of the old. I am ready to change." And what about you? How ready are you today? Metal does not need fire. It needs you to remember it was once a star. I used to believe that life was something I could control if only I were smart enough, disciplined enough, strategic enough. I set countless goals, crafted detailed plans for each month, each year, and believed that if I followed them exactly, everything would run like a perfect machine. But the harder I tried, the more things slipped through my hands. What I thought was certain disappeared at the last moment. The people I believed would walk with me to the end stopped halfway. And then I began to question not just my plans, but the very way I was showing up in this life. Perhaps what I thought was control was simply a form of fear in disguise. I realized there are things that cannot be forced, cannot be bargained with, like the weather, like emotions, like growth, and above all, like reality. Because reality does not listen to requests, it listens to tone. If your tone is clear, you don't need to plead. If your tone is off, even when you say the right things, life will not respond the way you expect. So instead of straining with calculations and expectations, I began to learn how to observe. I stepped back, not to give up, but to see what within me was truly sending out the signal, guiding all outcomes. And what I saw was not the list of positive affirmations I had pasted into my notebooks, but a system of frequencies inside me, sometimes transparent, sometimes chaotic. And it was this system that was steering my life. I slowly learned to be silent when my inner world was still in conflict. I stopped speaking when my inner voice was unclear. Not because I feared being wrong, but because I knew words cannot travel far if they are not lifted by inner truth. I used to join conversations just to feel like I existed. But then I realized that when you no longer need to prove your presence with words, you begin to understand that true presence begins in the absence of words. It is in those moments that you connect with others more deeply, not through what you say, but through what you no longer need to say. Life began to change, not when I learned a new skill, but when I adjusted the entire tone of how I lived. I no longer spoke of gratitude on days I felt loss. I did not force joy when what I needed was to cry. And strangely, when I was honest with my emotions, they became softer easier to breathe through. I no longer needed control because I was no longer running. From that honesty, I saw more clearly the old patterns that had governed me. I had tried to appear ideal in the eyes of others, thinking that if I never hurt anyone, never caused discomfort, I would be loved. But then I understood, you cannot be truly loved if you are not truly present. And you cannot be present if you are constantly adjusting yourself just to fit someone else's expectations. When you live outside your own frequency, you exist only as a shadow of someone else's desire. You are not real, and the world cannot hear someone who is not real. I began to learn how to live with my imperfections. I did not paint over them, did not fight them, simply stayed with them. And from that, what I said began to carry a different tone. No longer the sound of someone needing recognition, just sharing. A calm sharing, not seeking a response, but carrying its own quiet weight. Because when a person lives in truth, their words carry the energy of that truth, and it is that energy that makes others stop and listen. The deepest persuasion does not come from sharp reasoning or eloquent delivery. It comes from alignment. When what you say matches how you live, and how you live matches what you believe, there is no need to emphasize. Everything becomes clear on its own. Like light needs no invitation to be seen. Like fragrance needs no advertisement to be felt. They simply need to be present in the right way, and the world will find them. I realized that change does not begin with setting new goals, but with adjusting the inner state from which you live. If you live in lack, then no matter how grand your actions, they are only compensation. If you live in fear, then every step forward is just a disguised retreat. But if you live in clarity, then even a small act is enough to create waves of transformation, because it is in tune. And what is in tune always carries power. No need for display. And then I understood. To change reality, you do not need another plan. You need to return to the original voice within you, the voice that was drowned out by external noise, the voice that does not try to persuade, does not seek to win, but always knows what is true. And when I began to live from that place, I no longer needed the world to hear me, because I had become clear enough that life could no longer ignore me. That is not magic. That is the result of a silent but profound journey. A journey back to myself, not through mirrors, not through others' eyes, but through one tone, a true tone. And that is the turning point. Not loud, but enough for everything to begin again. Time is the finest dancer when you learn to lead it. I once sat in a quiet old room. No music, no phone, just a faint light shining through the window, and a silence I had not dared to face for a long time. No one forced me into silence, but something inside quietly whispered, "Say nothing." And then, from within that silence, another sound became clearer, not voiced, not in any specific tone, but it was alive, and it knew. It was not a thought, nor a feeling. It was awareness. A very subtle, very real awareness, unmistakable and pure. That was when I understood. Silence is not an empty space. It is the only space wide enough for you to return and truly hear yourself. This is the power of voice within. Not just a voice you hear, but a space you return to. I began to realize that every answer I had ever searched for outside was already within. But it did not lie in the teachings I memorized, nor in the advice I had written down, and certainly not in debates of right or wrong. It lay in the space between all thoughts, in the place where I no longer tried to control. It was like the surface of water, able to reflect the sky only when it stopped moving. And in that moment, what I needed was not to run outward looking for new voices, but to return and fine-tune the frequency within myself. I had lived for so long with the wrong voice. Not wrong because it was negative, but because it was not true. It was a version I created to meet expectations, to please, to be accepted. I thought that if I spoke in the way the world wanted, I would be loved. But the more I tried, the more lost I became. Because what I lost was not opportunity, but the ability to recognize my true voice. Then I understood, the world does not need you to speak beautifully. It needs you to live truthfully. The voice that carries the most weight does not come from your throat, but from the depths you have walked through within. It is the echo of experience, of courage, of responsibility. You cannot borrow someone else's voice and expect it to work in your life. You must find your own voice in moments when no one applauds, no one listens, no one understands. Because only when you can stand firm in that silence do you earn the right to speak something real. I once spoke many things that did not come from within, and life responded clearly. People nodded, but they did not change. They supported, but did not stay. Not because they did not believe me, but because they could not feel me. Frequency does not lie. No matter how clever your words are, if the living energy within you does not align with what you say, the world will sense the dissonance, and it will not follow. I began my journey back to my true tone through small things. I stopped making promises I was unsure about. I stopped nodding when I had doubts. I stopped smiling when I was hurting. Not to make things difficult for others, but to make myself clear. And the clearer I became, the stronger my inner voice grew. It did not help me win every argument, but it helped me remain whole. And sometimes, staying whole in a world that constantly shifts is the bravest thing you can do. When you speak from the right voice, you no longer need validation. You do not need to force anyone to understand. You only need to live in the right frequency. And from there, life begins to adjust. The people who once overlooked you begin to turn and listen. The opportunities that passed you by start to reappear. Not because you tried harder, but because you became someone who emits a clear signal. You become easier to notice, easier to trust, easier to connect with. And that cannot be achieved through skill alone. It comes only from the alignment between what is inside and what is expressed outside. I used to think that changing my life meant doing something grand. But in the end, what changed me most deeply began with a simple decision to stop pretending. I no longer tried to be called strong when I was tired. I no longer tried to appear positive when what I needed was honesty. And when I dared to live that way, my inner voice began to rise more clearly. I did not need to speak more. I only needed to speak more truthfully. This is the power of voice within. Not just a voice you hear, but a space you return to. A space where you do not need to explain, do not need to fix, only need to be present with truth. A space where you are allowed to breathe deeply without guilt. A space where you do not try to be right. You simply choose to be real. And from that place, you will know when to speak, when to stay silent, when to move forward, and when to pause. Not because someone told you, but because you already know. This world is not lacking voices. This world is waiting for those who speak from true tone. Those who dare to live, dare to listen, dare to return. Those who are not swept away by the noise, but know how to find their quiet center. And if you still keep that connection to your true voice, you will never be lost, no matter how loud the world gets. Because you have a place to return to, a place no one can touch but you. And from that place, all that is right will come on its own. No forcing, just stay clear. So clear that you no longer need to say much, but when you do speak, the world will pause and listen, because it is no longer just sound. It is truth being spoken, and nothing is more powerful than that. Music does not lie in the sound, but in the silence that listens. I used to believe that real change came from dramatic turning points, from the wake-up call after a crisis or the impact of hitting rock bottom. But the deeper I journeyed into life, the more I realized that lasting change often begins with the smallest moments, so quiet that no one else might even notice. Like when you choose not to answer in the same old way, when you decide to go to bed on time instead of drifting through social media, or when you pause to ask yourself if what you are about to say is truly needed, or simply a way to fill a space inside. Real change does not begin the moment you shout that you have changed, but the quiet instant when you stop living the old pattern altogether. One morning, I woke up and felt no need to prove anything anymore. No need to appear strong. No need to fake positivity while I was silently struggling inside. I simply wanted to live honestly, even if that meant being admired less, praised less, or misunderstood more. But I accepted that, because I finally understood that being honest with myself mattered more than any fleeting approval. When you dare to live truthfully, life may not get easier right away, but it becomes clearer. You begin to feel every breath, every thought, every subtle movement in yourself that you used to ignore while chasing expectations. I started choosing new words to speak to myself. I stopped calling myself not enough. I stopped using harsh language when I made mistakes. I stopped repeating silent judgments rooted in the past. Instead, I began asking gently, what do I truly need? Do I need rest, or do I need to face something? Do I need to keep going, or do I need to pause? And as I began this conversation with a new tone, something unexpected happened. The relationships around me began to shift. People who used to be irritable became more gentle. Situations that once triggered panic passed more smoothly. Not because the world had changed, but because I had changed the frequency I was living on. I no longer broadcasted distress. I was sending out a signal of wholeness, and the world responded accordingly. I remember once standing in front of a mirror and realizing that most of the time I had been playing a role written by someone else. A role expected to be stable, successful, agreeable, and always knowing what to say. But the truth is, within me, many different selves coexist. A vulnerable part that needs protection. A rebellious part that longs to be free. A quiet part that deserves respect. And if I kept silencing these voices just to fit a mold, then no matter how successful I became on the outside, I would always feel incomplete. So I decided, if life is a piece of music, I don't want to play a perfect melody just to be applauded. I want to play the notes that are truly mine, even if they are sometimes shaky or out of rhythm, because at least that would be a real song. And when I live my real music, I no longer need to compare, because everyone has their own tone, their own rhythm. You cannot judge a slow ballad by the standards of an upbeat track, just as you cannot understand a human being by only looking at what they show on the surface. When I began to listen more deeply to myself, I started to distinguish between the true call and the echo of old expectations. I no longer made choices out of fear of missing out, but because they matched my natural rhythm. I stopped accepting invitations just to be polite. I started filtering, carefully choosing what actually nourished me. And from that filtering, I rebuilt my entire ecosystem, from friendships to work to my living space. Every choice came from inner fullness, not from trying to fill a void. I stopped seeing myself as a project that needed fixing. I began to see myself as a river constantly growing, sometimes rushing, sometimes still. And I learned to trust that even in moments of stillness, I was still evolving. Growth does not always make noise. Sometimes it is just a quiet shift in awareness. When you see an old thing with new eyes, when you no longer react in old ways, when you can stay present even as the world around you sways. I once thought that living truthfully was risky, but now I know living untruthfully is even more dangerous. It drains your energy just to maintain an image that no longer reflects your essence. It causes you to lose your intuition, to silence your inner voice. And when you lose that voice, you will constantly need others to tell you who you are. But the real voice is not outside. It lives within you. And only when you are still and honest enough will you be able to hear it. Not the echo of the past, but the call of the present. A subtle sound, clear and calm, with no need for explanation. No need to perform, a sound that, once you align with it, you no longer need to convince anyone, because you have become yourself. And that is always enough. The final truth lies in the mirror. I never thought I would one day sit down and write my story without embellishment, without sparkle, just the plain fragments of a journey to reclaim my original voice. But today, if you're still here, reading these last lines, then I know there's already a real thread connecting us. No one reaches the end of a long story by accident, unless something familiar has stirred quietly in their heart. Perhaps you too have felt lost, exhausted from trying to live up to expectations. Perhaps you too have once heard your own voice, but forgot it because the noise around was too loud. And maybe, just maybe, you're finally ready to return to the quiet space within yourself, where no one but you has the right to define who you are. I didn't write all this to tell you how to live. I don't believe in formulas for happiness. What I believe is this: when a person is brave enough to live truthfully and has the courage to mute all external voices, they will hear something no one else can teach them, the truth within. It is a voice that is never loud, but always present, not dazzling, but undeniable. And if you can find it, hold it, and live from that place, then you will no longer need to ask where life is taking you, because you will have become the one steering. Growth does not begin with how much more we learn, but the moment we pause and honestly look at ourselves. From there, transformation begins. From there, we no longer try to make others understand. We begin to live so clearly that no explanation is needed. And I believe if you are reading this with an open heart, then you are already ready. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need a grand plan. You just need to choose one honest thing today and live it fully. Maybe it's the silence in a meaningless conversation. Maybe it's a gentle no instead of an automatic yes. Maybe it's a morning spent simply breathing, not to meditate perfectly, but to be truly present. These seemingly small things are actually the beginning of something very large. The journey of living in harmony with your true voice. I want to thank you. Thank you for your time, your patience, and your trust in walking with me to this point. Every word you read, every reflection you hold in your heart is a part of this awakening journey. I'm not here to be your guide, but if what I've shared has touched something within you, then I am grateful that we met at a deeper level of life. A place that needs no titles, no perfect image, just honest presence and a mutual desire to grow. And if this touched you, don't let it stop at emotion. Turn it into action. Say the thing you've been hiding. Forgive what you've kept buried. Give yourself one small chance to begin again. The world doesn't need you perfect. The world needs you clear. Clear enough to stand alone in stillness and not lose yourself. That is the most powerful kind of presence, and I believe you are capable of living that way. So if you're ready, step out of the old patterns. Place your hand on your heart and ask yourself, what do I want to live out today? Then quietly go do it, without applause, without needing anyone to approve. As long as you know and you stay steady in your steps, that is when you are truly strong. And once you begin to live from that place, all the doors will open in ways your mind could never imagine. Finally, I hope to meet you again in the next video. There, we will continue to explore the deeper layers of this journey, not to move faster, but to walk stronger. Not to become someone new, but to return to who we truly are, fully and without hesitation. And if one day you feel lost, return to the voice within. Because like I said, this is the power of voice within. Not just a voice you hear, but a space you return to. I believe if you still carry that subtle awareness, that sensitivity within your heart, and a commitment to your inner truth, then no matter how loud or chaotic the world becomes, you will keep walking. And if this journey has stirred something in you worth beginning, remember, you are not alone. Those who live true to themselves always recognize one another, without too many words, just through the clarity of tone, the honesty of energy, and the courage to live by the truest thing they've ever known. See you in the next video. And in every quiet transformation you go through, the journey continues, and you are on your way home.